Welcome to Clandestine Cases, where every story is a new mystery waiting to be solved. Grab a coffee, stay curious, and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let's get started with Miss Marple and the Bone China Murders. Chapter 1. The Tea That Tasted of Death. The village of St. Mary Mead was at its most picturesque on that warm August afternoon. The gardens were in full bloom, hollyhocks and delphiniums standing tall behind neatly trimmed hedges, and the scent of roses lingered in the air. At the vicarage, a gathering of ladies and gentlemen sat around a long table under the shade of a sprawling chestnut tree. The occasion was nothing extraordinary. A simple afternoon tea arranged by Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, in honor of Mrs. Henry Braithwaite, who had recently returned from an extended stay in Bath. Miss Marple, seated comfortably in a wicker chair with her knitting in hand, observed the proceedings with mild interest. Mrs. Clement had ensured that everything was arranged just so. The best bone china teacups, a silver tea service polished to perfection, and an assortment of scones, cakes, and cucumber sandwiches placed in delicate towers. Conversation was as genteel as ever, with discussions of local matters. Mrs. Lestrange's mysterious nephew, the colonel's new gardener, and the latest peculiarities of Mr. Phelps, the postmaster, who had recently taken to locking his door during working hours. It was during such an exchange, just as Mrs. Braithwaite was extolling the benefits of a certain mineral water she had encountered in Bath, that Mrs. Audrey Prentice, a woman of considerable social standing and even greater opinion, lifted her teacup to her lips, took a single sip, and froze. For a brief moment, she remained utterly still, as though in contemplation. Then, her expression twisted into one of horror. Her fingers trembled, a delicate china cup slipping from her grasp and shattering against the stone patio. A low, gurgling sound escaped her, throat, thud. The impact sent the silver teapot rattling, a cascade of Darjeeling spilling across the white linen cloth. There was a moment of stunned silence before the inevitable chaos erupted. Mrs. Clement let out a small, startled scream. Dr. Haydock, who had been in the midst of buttering a scone, leapt to his feet, moving swiftly to Mrs. Prentice's side. Miss Marple, though outwardly composed, set aside her knitting with the utmost care, her sharp blue eyes fixed intently on the scene before her. Dr. Haydock bent down, fingers at the side of Mrs. Prentice's throat. His face darkened. "She's dead," he announced, his voice clipped and grave. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled guests. Mrs. Bantry, usually so quick with an observation, was momentarily struck dumb. Mrs. Clement clutched at her throat, her face draining of color. Miss Hartnell, a formidable woman with an unfortunate tendency toward dramatics, whispered, "Poison." The word sent a shiver through the gathering. Inspector Slack arrived within the hour, his usual brusque manner heightened by the evident importance of the case. He surveyed the scene with the air of a man who had seen it all before and was merely waiting for someone to confess outright. He turned to Dr. Haydock. "Cause of death?" Dr. Haydock exhaled sharply. "It was quick, very quick. I'd hazard a guess at something like strychnine or cyanide. There was no real struggle, just immediate collapse. We won't know for sure until the post-mortem." Inspector Slack turned his attention to the tea service. "Who poured the tea?" Mrs. Clement, still pale but composed, raised a trembling hand. "I did. But it was from the same pot. We all drank from it." Slack's brow furrowed. "Then how is it that only Mrs. Prentice was affected?" Miss Marple's soft voice interjected. "Perhaps because the poison was not in the pot at all, but in her cup alone." The inspector turned to regard her, irritation flickering across his face. "And what makes you say that, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple gave him a mild smile, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Observation, Inspector. It is so often the little things, you know. Mrs. Prentice was the last to be served. Her cup, if you recall, was different from the others. A rather lovely piece, Wedgwood, I believe. She insisted upon using it, rather than the set Mrs. Clement provided." There was a murmur of recollection. Mrs. Bantry nodded. "Yes, I remember now. She always had that silly little habit. Something about preferring thinner porcelain, wasn't it?" Inspector Slack's expression darkened. "Then that means whoever placed the poison did so knowing that cup would be hers. This wasn't some random accident." "No," Miss Marple agreed, her voice soft. "It was deliberate." Silence settled over the gathering, thick and heavy with unspoken thoughts. Someone among them had killed Mrs. Prentice. The question was, why? Mrs. Prentice, for all her overbearing ways, had certainly made enemies. She was not a woman given to discretion. Only last week, she had been heard remarking upon the rather unfortunate state of the Lestranges' finances. And then there was that unpleasant matter involving her late husband's will, some business about an estranged relative who had been rather cross at finding himself left out. Miss Marple's mind ticked over these possibilities with the quiet efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Inspector Slack began his questioning, but Miss Marple remained silent, watching. The smallest things gave people away. The nervous way Mr. Phelps toyed with his cufflink, the way Miss Hartnell's gaze flickered to the shattered teacup before quickly looking away. These were not yet answers, merely clues, fragments of a much larger picture. But Miss Marple knew that a pattern would emerge, as it always did. As the sun began to set behind the rolling fields of St. Mary Mead, the village, so full of its charming little routines, found itself on the precipice of something dark. Murder had come to their doorstep, as it sometimes did in the most unexpected of places, and as Miss Marple sat quietly in her chair, listening to the murmurs of the gathered guests, she knew that the tea that had tasted of death had been no accident. It was merely the beginning. Chapter 2. A bone china cup and a blood-stained floor. The village of St. Mary Mead had suffered its fair share of scandal before. There was something singularly chilling about murder, particularly one that had occurred in such an ordinary fashion, over a cup of tea no less. News of Mrs. Audrey Prentice's sudden and violent death spread rapidly through the community, whispered over hedges and exchanged in hushed voices at the village grocer's. By the next morning, speculation was rife, and the sense of unease was palpable. Miss Marple, as was her custom, went about her day with quiet efficiency. She had long known that the genteel charm of village life was an illusion, a lace curtain behind which lurked pettiness, jealousy, and, on occasion, something much darker. But even she had not expected the events that would unfold at the Braithwaite residence later that afternoon. Mrs. Henry Braithwaite had been a widow for nearly 5 years, though one would not know it from the way she carried herself. Always impeccably dressed, her manner crisp and efficient. She had returned to St. Mary Mead only recently, after a long stay in Bath, where she had been tending to her health. It was in her modest but well-appointed drawing-room that the second terrible discovery was made. It was Mrs. Bantry who had the misfortune to find the body. She had called upon Mrs. Braithwaite shortly after lunch, a friendly visit in light of the unsettling events of the previous day. The door had been slightly ajar, which in itself was unusual, for Mrs. Braithwaite was the sort who valued propriety and security in equal measure. Tentatively stepping inside, Mrs. Bantry had called out, but received no reply. The silence within the house was unnerving. The usual ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed louder than usual, each measured second dragging with ominous weight. As she ventured further inside, something caught her eye, a peculiar glint on the floor of the drawing room. And then she saw it. Mrs. Braithwaite lay sprawled across the carpet, her body twisted at an unnatural angle. A pool of dark crimson had spread beneath her head, stark against the pale floral fabric of her dress. Her right hand was outstretched, fingers frozen in an almost grasping position. Close to her, just inches from her fingertips, lay a delicate bone china cup, unbroken but stained with a faint rim of deep brown. A strangled gasp escaped Mrs. Bantry's lips as she stumbled backward, her hands flying to her mouth. For a moment, she was unable to move, transfixed by the tableau before her. Then, with a great effort, she turned on her heel and fled into the street, crying out for help. It was not long before the village constable arrived, followed swiftly by Inspector Slack, whose usual gruff demeanor was tinged with something resembling unease. The sight of a second body in as many days had clearly rattled him. Dr. Haydock was summoned once more, and after a brief examination, straightened with a grave expression. "She's been dead for at least an hour," he pronounced. "Blunt force trauma to the back of the head, a nasty blow. And look here." He gestured to the cup, still warm. She had just taken tea before she was struck. Inspector Slack let out a heavy breath. Poison first, then a blow to the head. Miss Marple, who had arrived at the scene in her usual unobtrusive manner, shook her head. "No, Inspector. I rather think it was quite the opposite." He frowned at her. "Meaning?" Miss Marple's eyes were keen as she surveyed the room. "She was struck first. Then someone placed the cup near her hand. But look, the cup is quite whole. If she had fallen while holding it, surely it would have broken. And yet, here it is, in perfect condition, with only the slightest trace of tea inside. It was placed there, deliberately, after the fact." Inspector Slack pursed his lips, taking in the scene with fresh scrutiny. "You're saying it's staged?" Miss Marple nodded. "I do believe so. Someone wanted it to appear as though Mrs. Braithwaite had been poisoned, just as poor Mrs. Prentice was, but, in reality, she was killed quite differently." The inspector let out a low curse, rubbing the back of his neck. "And what do you make of it, then? A connection to yesterday's murder?" Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the body. "Oh, yes. The two are undoubtedly linked. The question, of course, is how." The suspects were plentiful. Mrs. Braithwaite had never been what one would call universally adored. She had a tendency toward sharp remarks and an unwavering belief in her own moral superiority. More than one villager had felt the sting of her judgmental nature. Only recently, she had been overheard making an unkind remark about Mr. Phelps's financial difficulties. And then there was the curious matter of her late husband's will, an inheritance that had been subject to much quiet speculation. But there was something else too, a lingering sense that the murderer had acted in haste. Miss Marple's sharp eyes took in the details. The disturbed rug, as though something had been dragged across it. The scuff mark near the writing desk, the faint scent of lavender, oddly out of place. Small things, but things that mattered. As Inspector Slack barked orders for statements to be taken and the scene to be properly examined, Miss Marple remained quietly thoughtful. The murderer had made a mistake. Somewhere in the details, in the smallest of overlooked things, lay the answer. The village of St. Mary Mead, with its charming cottages and well-mannered society, was no stranger to secrets. But Miss Marple knew one thing above all. Secrets had a way of revealing themselves, and she intended to see that they did. Chapter 3. The Silent Guest at Greystone Manor. The events of the past 2 days had left the village of St. Mary Mead in a state of hushed agitation. Murder, that most distasteful and metropolitan of crimes, had found its way to their tranquil lanes not once, but twice. The deaths of Mrs. Prentice and Mrs. Braithwaite had cast a shadow over the usual pleasantries of daily life. Conversations at the village grocer's were held in muted tones, glances were exchanged with more than usual suspicion, and the tea shop, usually bustling with chatter, had taken on an air of quiet speculation. But nowhere was the unease more pronounced than at Greystone Manor. The grand estate standing on the outskirts of the village had long been a subject of admiration. Its imposing facade, framed by ivy-clad walls and ancient yew trees, spoke of centuries of quiet aristocracy. It was the home of Major Harold Redfern, a retired military officer whose reputation was as formidable as his bearing. The Major had spent his later years tending to his rose garden, maintaining the impeccable order of his household, and ensuring that the manor remained a symbol of the old world. It was to Greystone Manor that Miss Marple found herself invited on that particular evening. The Major, despite his outwardly brusque nature, had always harbored a certain respect for her keen intelligence, and with the recent murders, he had sent a note, terse and to the point, requesting her company for tea. Miss Marple, ever the picture of modesty, had accepted without hesitation. It was often through the most ordinary of conversations that the most extraordinary truths revealed themselves. The evening air had begun to cool as she arrived at the manor. The sky painted in strokes of lavender and dusky rose. A butler of severe countenance, who introduced himself as Sloane, led her through the grand entrance hall, past portraits of Redfern's long gone, and into the drawing-room where the Major awaited her. "Miss Marple," he said, rising stiffly to greet her, "good of you to come." She inclined her head politely. "It is always a pleasure, Major." A tea tray had been arranged with military precision, and as they settled themselves, the Major wasted no time in coming to the point. "This business with Mrs. Prentice and Mrs. Braithwaite," he said gruffly, "it's damned unsettling. 2 women, both poisoned, or at least that was the first assumption. And now this talk of a blow to the head. It's got the whole village on edge." Miss Marple nodded, delicately taking a sip of her tea. "Indeed, it is most troubling." The Major drummed his fingers on the arm of his chair. "There's something I haven't told the police, Miss Marple. I don't much care for that Inspector Slack. Too quick to assume, not enough patience to listen." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "There's been someone in the grounds at night." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her knitting needles slowed ever so slightly. "Oh?" The Major gave a curt nod. "Sloane's seen them, and so have I. A figure, standing near the edge of the orchard, just beyond the rose garden. Never comes close to the house, never makes a sound, just stands there, watching." Miss Marple considered this. "And you've no idea who it might be?" "No," the Major admitted, "and that's what concerns me. At first, I thought it might be one of the local lads up to no good, but the way they stand, it's not the kind of skulking you'd expect from a petty thief. There's a purpose to it, a presence." Miss Marple set down her cup with quiet precision. "And you've reason to believe it might be connected to the murders?" The Major hesitated, then reached into the pocket of his jacket. He withdrew a small folded piece of paper and handed it to her. "Sloane found this near the terrace this morning." Miss Marple unfolded the paper. The message was brief, scrawled in uneven handwriting. "You should have left well enough alone." She studied it carefully. The ink was smudged slightly, the handwriting neither neat nor careless, merely functional. She glanced up. "And you've no idea to whom this was intended?" The Major exhaled. "Mrs. Braithwaite was here the evening before she was killed. She had tea with my sister." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted ever so slightly. "Tea?" "Yes," the Major said. "She had some rather strong opinions about my family's affairs. I rather suspect she came to share them, uninvited." Miss Marple's fingers brushed the edge of the note. "And your sister? Did she take kindly to Mrs. Braithwaite's visit?" The Major's expression darkened. "Miss Marple, if you knew my sister, you would know that she takes kindly to no one." A distant clock chimed the hour. Beyond the heavy drapes of the drawing-room, the evening had deepened, the shadows outside stretching long across the grounds. There was something almost oppressive in the silence that followed. Then, quite suddenly, a sound, a faint rustling like footsteps on gravel. The Major stiffened, his hand instinctively going to the walking cane at his side. Miss Marple did not turn, but she listened. The sound came again, slow, deliberate. Then it stopped. The Major rose abruptly, crossing the room in long, purposeful strides. He reached the window, pulling the curtain aside sharply. The garden was cast in twilight, the last vestiges of daylight painting the stone pathway in muted tones. But there, just beyond the rose bushes, stood a figure. It was motionless, its form half obscured by the deepening gloom. And then, as though sensing it had been seen, it turned, slowly, deliberately, and vanished into the darkness. Miss Marple sighed. "It appears, Major, that your silent guest has returned." The Major let out a low, frustrated growl. "Damn it all! What do they want?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but firm. "That, I think, is what we must find out." The evening had taken on a curious chill. In the distance, an owl hooted softly, the only sound to punctuate the hush that had settled over Greystone Manor. But even as the night deepened, Miss Marple knew that somewhere, in the shadows of the village, the answers waited, silent, but not forever unseen. Chapter 4. A knock at the window reached midnight. St. Mary Mead lay in slumber beneath a silvered moon. The village cottages nestled in quiet repose. Their chimneys dark against the night sky. The air was still, save for the occasional rustling of ivy against brick, or the distant hoot of an owl from the wooded lanes beyond the churchyard. But within the drawing-room of Miss Marple's neat little cottage on the High Street, a lamp still burned, casting a soft glow upon an unfinished row of knitting. Miss Marple herself sat in her armchair, her needles momentarily still, her mind busily threading together the recent events that had unsettled the peace of the village. The deaths of Mrs. Prentice and Mrs. Braithwaite had sent ripples of unease through the community, and the strange presence lurking near Greystone Manor had only deepened the mystery. The Major's discovery of that cryptic note had troubled her greatly. People, she reflected, were often much the same, bound by their little vanities, their jealousies, their small, insidious grudges. It was human nature that interested her most, the tendency for the smallest things to fester into something quite dangerous indeed. She reached for her teacup, now long cooled, when a sound interrupted the hush of the room. A knock, a faint, deliberate tap-tap against the window pane. Miss Marple did not startle, but she did pause. The knock came again, more insistent this time. The sensible thing, of course, would be to dismiss it as a trick of the wind or the movement of a tree branch. But Miss Marple had lived in St. Mary Mead long enough to know when something was out of the ordinary. Rising carefully from her chair, she moved toward the window, parting the lace curtain just an inch. The street beyond was empty. The cobbled road glowed faintly under the light of the gas lamps, and the cottages opposite stood in darkened stillness. Yet there had been something, or someone there, only a moment before. A shadow, a flicker of movement retreating down the lane, silent as a wraith. Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of thought before drawing the curtain closed once more. A person who wished to see her at such an hour would surely have knocked at the door, yet whoever it had been had chosen the window instead. Furtive, cautious, unwilling to be seen. It was, she thought, a rather telling choice. The next morning, the village awoke to whispers. It was Mrs. Phelps, the postmaster's wife, who first brought the news into circulation, her voice a mixture of horror and relish. "Burgled," she declared, leaning over the counter at the grocer's. "Poor Mr. Truscott's house, right at the edge of the village. Went to bed as usual, woke up to find his study ransacked." "Ransacked?" echoed Mrs. Bantry, pausing in the act of selecting a cabbage. "Oh yes," Mrs. Phelps continued, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial hush. "Drawers turned out, papers everywhere. Nothing taken, though. At least nothing of real value. The silver was left untouched." "Odd sort of burglary," Mrs. Bantry murmured. "And the police?" "Inspector Slack's already been," said Mrs. Phelps. "Says it was likely someone looking for documents. But what sort of burglar breaks into a house and leaves all the valuables behind?" What sort indeed? Miss Marple, who had arrived just in time to overhear this latest development, did not interrupt, though her mind was already at work. A burglary where nothing was stolen was no ordinary burglary, and more curious still was the timing. Only a day after the note had been discovered at Greystone Manor, warning against prying too deeply. A warning, she thought, that had been ignored. That afternoon, she paid a visit to Mr. Truscott, who was found pacing his study in an agitated manner, a cigar smouldering between his fingers. He was a stout man of advancing years, a solicitor by trade, though his practice had grown considerably smaller in recent times. His house, a modest but dignified affair, was still in some disarray, papers stacked haphazardly on his desk, a cabinet drawer hanging open. "Miss Marple," he said, puffing slightly, "come to hear all about the ghastly business, have you?" "I rather thought it would be the talk of the village," she said mildly, taking a seat by the fireplace. "Damn strange," he muttered, rubbing his chin. "They didn't take a thing, just made a mess of the place. You are quite certain nothing was missing?" Truscott hesitated. "Well, nothing of real value. A few old client files seem to have been disturbed, but nothing I can't piece together." Miss Marple's expression remained gentle. "And did any of those files pertain to Mrs. Braithwaite by chance?" Truscott's head jerked up. "How the devil did you know that?" Miss Marple merely smiled. "One learns to recognize patterns, Mr. Truscott. It is often the smallest details that point the way." He frowned, then exhaled heavily. "Yes. Well, she had some dealings here, years ago. A will, actually, her late husband's, and there were some complications." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Complications?" Truscott hesitated, then gave a short, humorless laugh. "Let's just say there was some disagreement over the terms of inheritance. A certain relative wasn't particularly pleased with the outcome." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. It was as she had suspected. Someone had been looking for something. A document, perhaps, that could not afford to be seen. A secret that, if uncovered, might explain everything. As she left Truscott's house and stepped into the afternoon light, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The knock at her window had not been an accident. It had been a message, a silent warning from someone who had seen more than they ought to have. But who? The pieces were shifting into place, but the picture was not yet clear. What she did know, however, was that someone in St. Mary Mead was growing desperate, and desperation, Miss Marple knew well, was a dangerous thing indeed. Chapter 5. The Whispering in the Hollow Lane. There were few places in St. Mary Mead that held as much quiet foreboding as Hollow Lane. It was a narrow, winding track that ran between the churchyard and the old mill, flanked by gnarled hedgerows that had long since overgrown, casting the lane in perpetual twilight, even on the brightest of days. The villagers, though never explicitly superstitious, avoided it after dark, citing practical reasons: poor footing, damp air, the likelihood of an overhanging branch catching one unawares. But there had always been mutterings of something more. Tales, passed down in hushed tones, of strange murmurs on the wind, of a presence unseen, but felt, lurking behind the tangled brambles. It was along this very lane that young Alice Carter, the housemaid at Greystone Manor, had fled in a state of terror the previous evening. At first, no one had paid much mind to her hysteria. Village girls were prone to flights of fancy after all, but by morning, the tale had grown into something rather more curious. She heard a voice. Mrs. Bantry recounted at the tea shop, her usual relish for gossip tinged with unease. Soft, like a whisper, calling her name, just beyond the bend in the lane, near the old well. Miss Marple, who was stirring her tea with delicate precision, merely raised an eyebrow. And did she see anyone? Mrs. Bantry pursed her lips. No, that's the odd part. She swears there was no one there. Across the table, Mrs. Phelps, the postmaster's wife, leaned in conspiratorially. She's not the first, you know. Old Mrs. Ludlow used to say she heard voices down that lane when she was a girl. And you remember Mr. Green, don't you? The man who left so suddenly. He was seen wandering there at night before he disappeared. Miss Marple smiled gently, though her mind was already at work. Ghost stories had their place, particularly in a village as old as St. Mary Mead, but more often than not, they concealed something far more tangible. People seldom spoke of what truly haunted them. They cloaked their fears in folklore, in whispers of the unnatural. That afternoon, she took a walk to Hollow Lane, her step measured, her expression as serene as ever. The air was damp with the scent of moss and turned earth, the hedge branches arching overhead like clasped fingers. She paused near the old well, its stones worn smooth with age. It was then, in the hush of the moment, that she heard it, a whisper, faint, drifting on the breeze. Miss Marple did not start, nor did she move hastily. Instead, she listened. The voice was indistinct, neither male nor female, but the cadence was peculiar, as though words were being formed without breath behind them. And then quite suddenly, silence. She remained where she was for a moment longer, her sharp blue eyes scanning the overgrown hedgerow, the twisted roots creeping through the underbrush. There was a presence, yes, but not of the spectral variety. Someone had been there, watching, and someone had wanted young Alice Carter to flee in terror. When she returned to the village, Inspector Slack was already making his presence known at the general store, his manner impatient as he questioned Alice Carter, who sat wringing her hands, pale as milk. "I know what I heard," Alice insisted, her voice tremulous. "It was saying my name." Miss Marple approached gently, her voice soothing. "And before that, my dear, had you seen anything unusual?" Alice hesitated. I don't know. I thought I saw something move behind the trees, but when I looked, it was gone." Inspector Slack scoffed. "A trick of the light, no doubt. There's no one hiding in the hedgerows, and there's certainly no ghost." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "No, I rather think not." She turned back to Alice. "Tell me, my dear, did you know Mrs. Braithwaite well?" Alice blinked. "Not very, miss. Only in passing." "But you were at Greystone Manor the evening she was last seen, were you not?" Alice's face went pale. Well, yes, but only because I was delivering a parcel for Mrs. Redfern." Miss Marple nodded kindly. "And did you happen to overhear anything while you were there?" Alice hesitated again, her fingers twisting in her lap. I didn't mean to listen, miss. That Mrs. Braithwaite and Mrs. Redfern were arguing. Something about papers. I don't know what, but Mrs. Braithwaite was saying she'd see the matter settled, that it was her duty to—" She broke off, looking frightened. Miss Marple patted her hand, reassuringly. "That is very helpful, Alice. You see, I do not think it was a ghost you heard at all." Inspector Slack folded his arms. "And what do you think it was, Miss Marple?" She smiled, her manner as gentle as ever. "I think it was a warning, and a rather deliberate one at that." That evening, as the village settled once more into its habitual stillness, Miss Marple sat in her parlour, considering all that she had learned. The whispering in Hollow Lane had not been supernatural in the least. It had been staged. But staged by whom? Someone who wanted Alice frightened into silence. Someone who believed she had overheard more than she truly had. She sipped her tea thoughtfully. The past had a way of creeping back, unearthing secrets that certain individuals would rather keep buried. And in St. Mary Mead, where everyone knew everyone else's business, there were always those who listened more closely than they should. As the clock chimed the hour, she allowed herself a small smile. Yes, the answers were there, and soon enough she would have them all. Chapter 6. The Vicar's Sinister Secret. The Sunday morning service at St. Mary Mead's parish church was quieter than usual, though the pews were still filled with the familiar faces of village life. The atmosphere, however, was one of unease. The deaths of Mrs. Prentice and Mrs. Braithwaite still lingered in the minds of the congregation, casting a shadow over the sermon delivered by Reverend Arthur Whitaker. The vicar was a well-liked man, kind and soft-spoken, known for his good works and unwavering devotion to his parishioners. A tall, slender gentleman, with neatly combed silver hair and round spectacles perched upon his nose, he spoke with a gentle authority, though this morning his voice seemed to falter on occasion. Those seated closest to the pulpit noticed that his hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages of his Bible. Miss Marple, in her usual place, 3 rows from the front, observed all of this with quiet attention. She had long since learned that one could tell a great deal from how a man conducted himself during a moment of ordinary routine, and there was something about the vicar's unease that troubled her. A man of the cloth had little to fear from earthly matters, unless, of course, he was not as untroubled as he appeared. The service concluded without further incident, and the congregation filed out into the bright summer morning. Outside the church, small groups formed, exchanging murmurs about the latest developments in the investigation. Inspector Slack had been seen questioning Mr. Truscott again, and there were rumors that the break-in at his house had unearthed something unexpected. Miss Marple, moving with unassuming grace, found herself beside the vicar as he stood at the churchyard gate, his hands still clasped together, his face slightly drawn. "A thoughtful sermon, Reverend," she said kindly. He started slightly, as though he had not noticed her approach, then smiled, though the expression did not reach his eyes. "Ah, Miss Marple, I am afraid I was somewhat distracted this morning." Miss Marple's expression remained gentle. "It is an unsettling time for all of us." "Yes," he murmured, his gaze drifting towards the village beyond. "It has been a most trying week." Miss Marple watched him carefully. "You seem particularly troubled, if I may say so. I do hope it is nothing too serious." The vicar hesitated, his fingers tightening briefly around the edges of his cassock. For a moment it seemed as though he would dismiss her concern. But then, quite unexpectedly, he sighed. "Would you walk with me a moment, Miss Marple?" They strode together through the churchyard, past the moss-covered gravestones and the yew trees that had stood sentinel for centuries. When the vicar finally spoke, his voice was low, as though he feared being overheard. "There is something I must tell you," he said at last, "something that has weighed upon me for many years." Miss Marple remained silent, her eyes kind but keen. "I was not always a vicar," he continued. "Before I took holy orders I was a different man. I was younger then, foolish, and I made mistakes. One in particular." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly, knowing that confessions, once begun, often tumbled forth of their own accord. "There was an incident," the vicar went on, his voice nearly a whisper now. "A death, an unfortunate accident. Or so I told myself at the time." Miss Marple's knitting bag swung gently at her side as she walked. "What kind of accident, Reverend?" He swallowed. "It was years ago, before I came to St. Mary Mead. I was employed at a school for boys, St. Oswald's, in Gloucestershire. One of the masters there, a man named Edwin Lorimer. He and I were not friends, Miss Marple. He hesitated. Let us say he was a man of poor character. He had a talent for discovering the weaknesses of others, for holding those weaknesses over them." Miss Marple's nod was almost imperceptible. "One evening there was an altercation," the vicar continued. "It was in the library. No one else was present. There was an argument. Heated words. He accused me of something dreadful, something untrue, but something which, had it been believed, would have ruined me. And then—" He stopped walking, inhaling sharply. Then he fell, backwards. His head struck the marble hearth. He died instantly. There was a long silence. A breeze whispered through the trees, rustling the ivy that clung to the church walls. "And what did you do?" Miss Marple asked, gently. The vicar exhaled slowly. "I panicked. I was a coward. I left him there and did not speak a word of what had happened. The official story was that he had tripped in the dark. There was no evidence to the contrary, and so the matter was laid to rest." Miss Marple's gaze was unwavering. "Until now," he nodded. "I received a letter 2 weeks ago, from someone who knew, someone who was there that night, unseen. The letter did not name me outright, but it alluded to my past, to what happened in that library. It was unsigned, but I recognized the handwriting." His fingers clenched around the edge of his sleeve. It was hers. Audrey Prentice's. Miss Marple inhaled softly, though she was not entirely surprised. Mrs. Prentice had always been a woman who prided herself on knowing the affairs of others, particularly those they wished to keep hidden. "Did you confront her?" The vicar nodded. "I went to see her at her home. I asked her what she wanted, what she hoped to gain. She claimed she wanted nothing. that it was simply a moral duty to bring such things to light. But I knew her better than that. His voice was bitter. She enjoyed having power over others. She relished it. Miss Marple's expression remained thoughtful. And now, she is dead. The vicar shuddered. You do not think... Miss Marple, you cannot think that I... She raised a hand, silencing him gently. I think, Reverend, that secrets have a way of surfacing at the most inconvenient times. And I think that whoever sent you that letter may not have been content to let things rest. They stood in silence for a moment longer. Then the vicar straightened, his expression weary but resolved. What do I do, Miss Marple? She looked at him kindly. The past is a most troublesome thing, Reverend. It does not stay buried as easily as we would like. But if I were you, I would consider who else might have known of this matter. Because it seems to me that someone in St. Mary Mead has been playing a very dangerous game. Indeed, as the bells of the church tower chimed the hour, Miss Marple turned back toward the village, her mind already working through the implications of what she had learned. The vicar's past was dark, yes, but darkness had a way of drawing others toward it. Those who saw opportunity in secrets, those who understood that power often lay in the knowledge of another's sins. And somewhere in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, someone had been watching, waiting, and ensuring that certain voices were silenced forever. Chapter 7. The woman who wore black lace twilight had settled upon St. Mary Mead, casting long wavering shadows across the cobbled streets and ivy-clad cottages. A hush had fallen over the village, the kind of quiet that came not from peace, but from whispered anticipation. The events of the past week, the deaths of Mrs. Prentice and Mrs. Braithwaite, the eerie presence at Greystone Manor, and the vicar's startling confession, had left an unmistakable ripple of unease among the residents. And now there was another name upon their lips, the woman in black. She had been seen twice now, always at dusk, gliding through the misty lanes like a wraith. No one could say for certain where she had come from. Mrs. Bantry swore she had seen her near the vicarage, a tall figure in a long dark gown, moving silently past the hedgerows. Mr. Phelps, the postmaster, insisted he had glimpsed her standing outside the Red Lion Inn, watching the village green with an air of quiet expectancy. And Alice Carter, still trembling from her experience in Hollow Lane, had caught sight of her through the back window of the tea shop, a pale face veiled in shadow. She was there, I tell you, Alice whispered to Miss Marple that evening, as the two sat by the fireside in the older woman's cozy parlor. Standing just outside, I could see the lace on her sleeves, black as night, and then, just like that, she was gone. Miss Marple regarded the girl kindly, over the rim of her teacup. Curious, she murmured. And did you notice anything else, my dear? Something distinctive about her manner? Alice frowned, her hands still worrying the hem of her apron. She moved, slowly, not like she was frightened or in a hurry, but as if she was waiting for something or someone. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. Yes, that would make sense. Alice hesitated before voicing the question on everyone's mind. Do you think she's got something to do with, well, you know, the murders? Miss Marple gave a thoughtful sigh. I think, dear, that if someone appears only at dusk and disappears without a trace, then they are either very determined to be seen or very determined to be forgotten. That night, as the last light faded beyond the rooftops, Miss Marple took a solitary walk through the village. It was something she often did when matters weighed upon her mind. There was something about the stillness of an evening that encouraged clarity. She walked past the churchyard, the headstones half hidden in the deepening gloom, and past the vicarage, where a single light still burned in the study window. Then, just as she turned onto the quiet path that led toward Greystone Manor, she saw her. The woman in black. She was standing at the edge of the lane, half concealed by the low branches of an overgrown hawthorn. Her gown was dark as ink, with lace edging that fluttered slightly in the night breeze. She wore a wide-brimmed hat, the veil pulled low, obscuring most of her face. And her posture was unmistakable, erect, still, waiting. Miss Marple did not falter, nor did she call out. Instead, she continued at her usual measured pace, as though she had not noticed the figure at all. But out of the corner of her eye, she observed what no one else had. The woman was not looking at her. She was looking toward Greystone Manor. Miss Marple walked on, allowing the moment to pass, and by the time she reached the bend in the road, the figure had vanished once more into the shadows. The next morning, news arrived at the breakfast tables of St. Mary Mead, carried in anxious voices and urgent whispers. A letter had been found at the door of Greystone Manor, sealed in black wax. It had been addressed not to Major Redfern, but to his sister, Beatrice. Inside was a single line of writing, carefully penned in a delicate, looping hand. "You know why I have come." Miss Marple listened as Mrs. Bantry relayed this latest development over morning tea, her voice thick with suspense. "And of course, no one knows who left it. The butler swears the door was locked when he retired for the evening. But there it was, plain as day at sunrise." Miss Marple took a measured sip of her tea. "And Miss Redfern? How did she react?" Mrs. Bantry pursed her lips. "Well, that's just the oddest part. She turned pale as milk, went straight up to her room, and hasn't spoken a word since." Miss Marple set down her cup with a soft clink. "Then I rather think we have our answer, don't we?" Later that afternoon, she paid a visit to Greystone Manor, where Beatrice Redfern sat in the drawing-room, her usual composure shaken. Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. "My dear, I believe you know the woman who has been seen wandering the village." Miss Redfern's hands clenched in her lap. I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple's expression did not change. "She came for you, did she not?" The silence stretched long between them. And then, quite suddenly, Beatrice exhaled a slow, shuddering breath. "She was my sister." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I see. She was dead," Beatrice whispered. "Or at least, that's what we were told. Years ago, she left home under dreadful circumstances. There was a scandal, you see. A child born out of wedlock. My father cast her out, and we never spoke of her again. Until now." Miss Marple nodded, her mind swiftly assembling the pieces. She returned, and she had a reason. Beatrice pressed a hand to her forehead. "I don't know what she wanted. She hesitated. I thought perhaps she wanted to claim what should have been hers." Miss Marple's gaze was gentle, but keen. "An inheritance?" A single nod. "Yes, but if she had come for that, she would have spoken to me directly. Instead, she lingered, waiting, watching." Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest. "Then, I believe it was not money she sought, but something far more dangerous." Beatrice's lips trembled. Revenge. Outside, the evening had begun to set in once more, the village slipping into its familiar dusk. Somewhere, beyond the hedgerows and the twisted lanes, a woman in black lace had come back from the past. And if Miss Marple was not mistaken, she had not returned alone, for wherever she walked, death followed. Chapter 8. A room that should have been locked. The heavy rain had begun just after dusk, sweeping in from the hills beyond St. Mary Mead, and soaking the narrow lanes in a steady, relentless drizzle. In the flickering glow of gas lamps, the village looked almost spectral, the thatched rooftops dark with moisture, the chimneys issuing thin curls of smoke that melted into the mist. Braystone Manor stood at the edge of it all, its stone facade glistening beneath the downpour, its tall windows casting a sullen glow into the night. Inside, Miss Marple sat beside the fire in the drawing-room, her knitting needles poised in her lap, though she had made no progress on her stitches. Opposite her, Major Redfern stared grimly at his drink, the amber liquid swirling against the cut glass, as though it too shared in his unease. The housekeeper swore the door had been locked, he said at last, his voice taut with frustration. Locked for years, and yet he broke off, shaking his head. I don't like it, Miss Marple. I don't like it one bit. Miss Marple, who had spent the past several decades listening to the concerns of men who thought themselves unshakable, merely gave a small nod. A locked room, left undisturbed, and suddenly found open. Her eyes were bright with interest. Yes, I imagine that is most troubling. Redfern sighed, rubbing a hand over his weathered face. When I inherited this house from my father, I had no reason to question the way things had always been. That room, the East Wing study, was sealed years before I was born. It was my grandfather's private space. After his death, my father had it shut up, and no one ever set foot inside again. He let out a short, humorless laugh. You know how these old houses are. They collect locked doors, the way some people collect silver. Miss Marple smiled gently. And yet, it appears this particular door did not stay locked. No, Redfern admitted. Sloane found it open this morning, while making his rounds. Thought it was a draft at first, but the key was still in place, turned in the lock from the inside. His expression darkened. I tell you, Miss Marple, there's something unnatural about it. Miss Marple did not believe in ghosts, nor did she subscribe to the kind of melodramatic superstitions that so often gripped the imagination of village life. But she did believe in patterns, and a long-sealed room opening of its own accord, just as a mysterious woman in black had begun haunting the village, was no coincidence. When Redfern had offered to show her the room, she had accepted at once. Now, as they ascended the grand staircase, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows along the walls, Miss Marple observed the subtle tension in the Major's posture. He was not a man easily rattled, but something about this room unsettled him. The east wing was colder than the rest of the house, the air heavy with the scent of old books and aged wood. The study door stood slightly ajar, its key still in place, just as Redfern had said. He hesitated only a moment before pushing it open fully. Inside, the room was frozen in time. Dust lay thick upon the mahogany desk, the Persian rug beneath their feet dulled with age. The furniture was draped with heavy sheets, though a few had been pulled aside, revealing dark leather armchairs and a walnut cabinet. Against the far wall, a tall bookcase loomed, its shelves crammed with brittle, yellowing tomes. The only sign of recent disturbance was the trail of footprints in the dust. Sloane's, most likely, though Miss Marple suspected they were not the only ones. She moved slowly, taking in the details with her usual, careful eye. You say no one has entered this room in decades? Redfern nodded. Not since my father was a boy. Miss Marple ran a gloved hand over the doth. Lay something incongruous. A single silver hairpin, delicate and curved, as though it had been slipped carelessly from its owner's hair. Miss Marple picked it up with interest. "This does not belong to your housekeeper, I presume?" Redfern scowled. "Mrs. Sims is 60 if she's a day, and I can't imagine her wearing such a thing." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No, I rather think not." She moved next to the bookcase, running her fingers lightly along the spines of the forgotten volumes. The dust was undisturbed, save for one particular gap where a book had been removed. The absence was subtle. Only someone with a keen eye would have noticed. She leaned in, reading the faded gold lettering on the books that remained. A history of the Redfern lineage, the last will and testament of Sir Albert Redfern, the legacy of Greystone Manor. Her gaze sharpened. "Major, do you recall what occupied this space?" He frowned, stepping closer. "Now that you mention it, yes. It was an old account book. My grandfather's records, I believe. I remember my father showing it to me once, when I was a boy. Had all sorts of notations about the estate." Miss Marple's hands rested lightly on the shelf. "A book detailing your grandfather's affairs." Redfern's expression darkened. "And now it's gone." A slow realization settled between them. Someone had broken into a room that had been locked for years, not in search of valuables, but for a single, seemingly unremarkable book. And the question that remained was, why? Miss Marple turned back toward the door, her mind already arranging the pieces. The reappearance of a woman long thought dead, the cryptic warning left on Greystone Manor's doorstep, and now this, an intrusion into a forgotten room, the theft of a book that might hold the key to secrets buried long ago. She glanced down at the silver hairpin in her palm. A small, a telling clue. The past was unearthing itself in St. Mary Mead, and someone was willing to kill to keep it hidden. She looked up at Redfern and smiled, the expression both kind and knowing. "I think, Major, that we are getting rather close to the truth outside." The rain drummed steadily against the manor windows, washing away the footprints in the gravel below. But inside, in a room that should have remained locked, the past had already stepped forward, and there was no turning it back. Chapter 8. A room that should have been locked. The rain had come in the night. A quiet, persistent drizzle that softened the edges of the village and left the rooftops of St. Mary Mead glistening in the grey morning light. The air smelled of damp earth and wet stone, and the few villagers who ventured outside did so wrapped in coats and scarves, their voices hushed, as though the recent string of misfortunes had rendered them unwilling to disturb the heavy silence that had settled over their lives. At Greystone Manor, however, there was no such stillness. A flurry of activity had overtaken the grand house, for the discovery of the open study door had unsettled its occupants in a way that no mere burglary or missing document could. The past, it seemed, had begun to push its way to the surface, and Miss Marple had no doubt that the answers they sought would be found behind that very door. Major Redfern had met her at the entrance, his usual military bearing somewhat diminished, his manner stiff with unease. He had not slept well, that much was clear, and though he attempted to downplay the significance of the matter, Miss Marple could see the tension in the lines around his mouth, the way his fingers twitched restlessly at his sides. "The door was always locked," he muttered, leading her down the hall. "My father told me it was my grandfather's study, sealed up after his death. No one ever questioned it." Miss Marple, ever the attentive listener, gave a mild nod. "And yet someone has entered it now." Redfern said nothing, merely pushed open the heavy wooden door. The room was draped in dust and shadow. A single window, its thick velvet curtains drawn, let in only a sliver of grey morning light, illuminating floating motes of dust in the air. The furniture was stately, but long unused. A vast mahogany desk stood at the center, a high-backed leather chair behind it, its arms cracked and worn with age. A towering bookcase lined the back wall, its shelves sagging under the weight of forgotten tomes, while a great cabinet loomed in the corner, its glass doors dulled with dust. The only sign of disturbance lay in the footprints left in the thick carpet, a path leading from the door to the desk, and curiously, to a small writing table against the far wall. Miss Marple moved with quiet precision, taking in the details with her sharp, bird-like gaze. She approached the desk first, running a gloved finger over its surface. A deep layer of dust remained undisturbed, save for one area where something had been removed, a rectangular shape, as if a book had lain there for some time. She turned to Redfern. "Did your father ever mention what was kept here?" He shook his head. "I don't think he ever entered this room after my grandfather died. He had a rather strained relationship with the man." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. A common enough story, particularly in old families where duty and expectation often took precedence over warmth. Her eyes drifted to the writing table in the corner, where the dust had likewise been disturbed. Someone had opened a drawer recently, and the faint imprint of fingers remained on its brass handle. She moved toward it, easing it open with the careful touch of one accustomed to handling delicate things. Inside lay a collection of yellowed papers, brittle with age, but beneath them something more unusual. A small velvet pouch, tied shut with a length of frayed ribbon. Redfern peered over her shoulder. That wasn't there before. Miss Marple did not comment. Instead, she loosened the ribbon and tipped the contents onto the desk. A single silver locket tumbled out, its chain tangled, its once polished surface dulled with time. With deft fingers, she pried it open. Inside was a miniature portrait, a young woman, dark-eyed and solemn, dressed in black lace. Miss Marple let out a small breath. "How very interesting." Redfern's expression darkened. "That's her, isn't it?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, the woman in black lace." There was a long silence. Then Redfern exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. "Miss Marple, I'm beginning to have a very bad feeling about all of this." She gave him a kind smile. "Then you are quite right to be concerned, my dear Major." The discovery of the locket, coupled with the missing book, painted a picture that was becoming steadily clearer. Someone had entered this room, someone searching for something that had been left undisturbed for years. But what was it? A secret kept too long, a truth buried in the shadows of family history. Miss Marple turned her attention back to the cabinet. It was a grand piece of furniture, the kind designed to hold ledgers and official documents. She opened its doors carefully, scanning its contents. Most were of little interest: estate records, financial statements, correspondence between the elder Redfern and various solicitors. But tucked into the very back, barely visible in the dim light, was a single, slim journal. She drew it out, dusting off the cover. The name embossed in gold at the top made her pause. Beatrice Redfern. Redfern stiffened beside her. "My aunt," he murmured. "She died years ago." Miss Marple turned the pages with the utmost care. The handwriting was delicate but precise. The ink faded, but still legible. A few passages caught her attention immediately. August 4th. "The child has been sent away. There was no other choice. Father insists that she must never return." It is better this way. A little further on, November 17th. I heard her crying in the corridor again last night. She says she will never forgive me, that she will come back one day. Miss Marple closed the book gently. It would seem, Major, that your aunt had a great deal more to do with the past than anyone suspected. Redfern was silent, his face pale. Miss Marple set the journal down with quiet reverence. A room that should have been locked, she murmured, and yet, when doors are shut too tightly, one cannot be surprised when someone comes back to open them. The past had begun to stir in St. Mary Mead, and with it, a long-buried truth. And as Miss Marple cast one final glance at the portrait inside the locket, she could not shake the growing certainty that the woman in black lace had not yet finished what she had come to do. Chapter 9. The last to drink from the cup. The victim's final moments were not what they seemed. The morning had broken cool and crisp over St. Mary Mead, the sun casting long shadows over the ivy-clad cottages that dotted the village's narrow lanes. The mist had lifted from the countryside, revealing the familiar, quiet beauty of the village, where life moved at a pace untouched by the world beyond. In the cozy tea shop on the corner, Mrs. Lancaster's scones filled the air with a comforting scent of warmth and butter, while the usual chatter of the villagers carried on as it always had. Yet, an undercurrent of tension had begun to stir. The unexpected death of Mr. Oliver Wentworth. The recent arrival to the village had cast a shadow over the morning's peace. Wentworth, a wealthy widower with a distant manor and no known enemies, had been found in his study the previous evening, dead from what seemed to be a heart attack. At least, that was the preliminary diagnosis from Dr. Matthews. But whispers, as they always did in St. Mary Mead, began to swirl, and suspicion settled like a heavy fog. Miss Marple, who had been quietly knitting in her parlour when the news had reached her, listened carefully as the village gossip reached her ears. Mrs. Lancaster, as always, was the first to inform her. Such a shock, Miss Marple. Mr. Wentworth found dead in his study just like that. They say it was a heart attack. That. She trailed off, eyes wide with the excitement of mystery, knowing that Miss Marple, with her sharp mind and gentle demeanour, would be the perfect person to turn to for answers. Yes, it is indeed a shock, Miss Marple had replied, her voice calm, though her mind was already working, piecing together the fragments of the story. A shame. Mr. Wentworth was quite a private man, wasn't he? Mrs. Lancaster nodded vigorously. Oh yes, never much of a talker, and not at all the sort to keep company. Always at home in his study or out in the garden. But I do recall him mentioning once that he'd recently met with a few people from London. Business, I believe. Strange business, if you ask me. Miss Marple had not asked, but she had noted it all the same. There was something in the way Mrs. Lancaster had said it that hinted at more than mere curiosity. The village was full of such whispers, the unspoken truths that everyone seemed to know, but no one dared to voice. Either time Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage the next morning. The scene had already been cordoned off. The body of Mr. Wentworth lay in his study, still positioned as if he had collapsed at his desk, a glass of brandy by his side. Dr. Matthews, standing over the body, shook his head gravely. A heart attack, Miss Marple. That's the conclusion I've come to. There's no sign of foul play. Miss Marple glanced at the room. The study was neat, almost too neat, as if someone had made a deliberate effort to tidy it. The desk was free of clutter, save for the brandy glass, which caught the light in an unusual way. It wasn't the usual sign of someone who had simply passed away in their sleep. Miss Marple's gaze flickered to the brandy bottle on the shelf, its contents barely disturbed. She allowed the doctor to finish his examination before speaking. "I wonder, Dr. Matthews, if we might take a closer look at the glass," she suggested quietly. The doctor gave her a look of mild surprise. "You believe there's more to it?" "I do," Miss Marple replied softly, but with a certainty that made Dr. Matthews pause. He gestured for the constable to carefully collect the glass and bring it to the lab for further analysis. As the day wore on, Miss Marple spoke to the few villagers who had visited the vicarage the previous afternoon. Mrs. Woodley, the housekeeper, had been the last to see Mr. Wentworth before he retired to his study. She had found him in good spirits. He'd remarked on the weather and mentioned a guest expected later that evening. But there had been no mention of any health concerns, no signs of distress. "I don't understand it, Miss Marple," Mrs. Woodley had said, wringing her hands. He'd been so full of life, talking of plans for the winter. And then this. It doesn't make sense. Indeed, it didn't. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the brandy glass, the way it had been placed so deliberately beside the body, as if someone had carefully set the scene. If Mr. Wentworth had truly died of a heart attack, why was the glass positioned so perfectly within reach, and why had the brandy been untouched? The more Miss Marple thought about it, the less the pieces seemed to fit. Hours later, the results from the lab confirmed her suspicions. There had been no heart attack. A glass of brandy had been laced with a potent poison, one that would cause symptoms remarkably similar to a heart attack. The discovery sent a ripple of shock through the village, for it seemed so unlike anything that had ever happened in St. Mary Mead. The people were used to the occasional misstep or small scandal, but a deliberate cold-blooded murder was something entirely new. Miss Marple spent the evening reflecting on the few details she had uncovered. The guests Mr. Wentworth had mentioned, the way the glass had been placed, everything pointed to a carefully planned act. But who would want him dead? And why? The answer came to her, as it always did, through a quiet moment of reflection. Mr. Wentworth had been a man of means, yes, but he had also been the last to drink from a cup that had been passed down through generations, a cup that was not his own, but belonged to a family with its own dark secrets, a family that had hoped for years that the cup would remain untouched. Miss Marple understood, with a quiet certainty, that the victim's final moments had not been the result of a sudden heart attack, but of a long-held grudge that had finally come to a head. The murderer, as Miss Marple had suspected, was none other than Mrs. Woodley, the housekeeper. Her family had once been the rightful heirs to the Wentworth fortune, but a bitter inheritance dispute had cost them everything. Mrs. Woodley, who had been so kind and seemingly innocent, had known for years the secrets her former employer had tried to bury. When Mr. Wentworth had spoken of plans for the future, he had been on the brink of finalizing a will that would have left everything to charity, excluding Mrs. Woodley's family entirely. In her rage, she had poisoned him with the very brandy he had so calmly poured for himself, ensuring that her revenge was swift and final. As Miss Marple spoke the words to the constable, a heavy silence fell over the room. The villagers, who had once thought of Mrs. Woodley as nothing more than a sweet old servant, now understood the true depth of her motives. Miss Marple gave a final thoughtful glance at the now empty study, where the faint scent of brandy still lingered in the air. "A cup passed down through generations," she murmured, "and yet it was the last to drink from it that paid the price." Chapter 10. The Watcher on the Moor, a Figure in the Mist. or just a trick of the eye? The fog had settled over St. Mary Mead that morning with an almost oppressive stillness. It was the kind of fog that crept in from the moors like a slow, creeping tide, blanketing the village in a grey, formless haze. The cottages, with their ivy-clad walls and thatched roofs, stood half-hidden in the mist, their chimneys sending thin tendrils of smoke curling into the air. It was as if the world had been swallowed up by the mist, leaving only a few brave souls to navigate through it. Miss Marple, wrapped in her well-worn shawl, had ventured out early that morning, having been invited to tea at Mrs. Lancaster's tea shop. The air was damp, and the moisture clung to her glasses, making the view a little more obscure than usual. Yet, despite the fog, there was something comforting about the village in its fog-bound state. The soft sounds of the village waking up, birds calling from hidden trees, the distant clink of the milk cart, gave the world an almost timeless quality. As Miss Marple made her way along the cobbled streets, she overheard snippets of conversation. There was a new air of tension, one that had settled over the village ever since the events at Greystone Manor and Mr. Wentworth's untimely demise. Today, the gossip wasn't focused on the past. It was about something else, something new. "Did you hear?" Mrs. Lancaster whispered in a hushed voice as Miss Marple entered the tea shop. "Mrs. Harding swears she saw a figure on the moor last night. A tall man, she says, standing in the mist, just staring. No one else saw him, mind you, but she insists he was there." "Mrs. Harding does have quite an imagination," Miss Marple replied, though the thought lingered in her mind. "But perhaps it's the fog playing tricks." Mrs. Lancaster nodded, clearly unsettled by the idea. "Yes, but she was so certain, Miss Marple. She said the figure just stood there, watching her window, and when she looked away for just a moment, when she looked back, he was gone." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. The figure on the moor, the idea was unsettling, yes, but hardly impossible. The moors were vast and treacherous, with their own strange allure. It would not be the first time someone had vanished into the fog, only to be later claimed by the land itself. But then again, there was always something more to such tales, wasn't there? A figure in the mist could be a trick of the eye, or perhaps it was something else entirely. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Major Redfern, his broad figure unmistakable even in the mist. He was, as usual, well dressed in his military uniform, though his usual air of confidence was diminished by the slight frown etched on his face. He approached the table where Miss Marple sat, his eyes scanning the room before focusing on her. "I hope I'm not interrupting, Miss Marple," he began, his voice a little strained, "but there's been another occurrence. One of the local farmers found something near the edge of the moor, a body, or what's left of it." At once, the fog seemed to grow heavier in Miss Marple's mind. "A body?" she asked, her voice calm but sharp. She had heard nothing of this yet. The village had always been quiet, and the idea of a murder so close to the village itself was almost unthinkable. "The body's been badly mauled," Major Redfern continued. "It's as though something or someone had been watching him for days. There are signs of a struggle, and yet the farmer insists that no one had been in the area at the time." Miss Marple set down her teacup, her thoughts clicking into place. A figure on the moor, watching from the mist. A body found, disfigured, as if it had been observed for some time before its final end. A connection began to form in her mind, though she was careful not to give anything away. It was far too early to make conclusions. "I'll come with you, Major," she said at last, rising from the table. "There may be more to this than meets the eye." The moor was eerily quiet as they made their way to the scene of the discovery. The fog, thick as ever, hung heavy in the air, muffling all sound except for the occasional call of a bird or the rustling of the wet grasses underfoot. The body, such as it was, lay, half hidden beneath a mound of rocks, the damp earth clinging to its broken form. It was a man, middle-aged, his clothes torn and bloodied. The sight was enough to turn even Major Redfern's usual stoic demeanor to one of discomfort. "What happened to him?" Miss Marple asked, her gaze sweeping over the scene. The constable, who was standing nearby, shifted uncomfortably. "We're not certain, Miss Marple. He was definitely attacked, but there's something strange about the whole thing. His face, well, it's not like anything I've ever seen. It's almost as if he'd been—" He trailed off, uncertain how to finish the thought. "Watched?" Miss Marple suggested gently. The constable nodded, though he looked uncomfortable at the idea. Miss Marple knelt down beside the body, her keen eyes scanning the details with her usual calm precision. The man's clothes, though torn, were not particularly fancy. Just work clothes, worn but well kept. A farmer, perhaps, but there was something odd about his posture, as though he had been sitting or standing for far too long in one spot before the attack had occurred. She observed the marks on his hands, scratches, perhaps from climbing, and the bruising on his neck. "Where was he last seen?" Miss Marple asked, standing up again. The constable hesitated. "He was known to frequent the local tavern, but no one saw him after dark last night." As they walked back toward the village, Miss Marple's mind was in motion, as always, processing the facts. There was something about the body's placement, the signs of observation, and the way the village had reacted to the rumors that felt familiar. The fog had played its part in obscuring the truth, but Miss Marple knew that the answers were hidden in plain sight. The next few days were filled with quiet inquiries, visits to the village tavern, and quiet conversations with the local farmers. The figure in the mist, it seemed, was not a ghost or a spectre, but a living, breathing man. Someone who had been close to the victim. Someone who had known him well enough to follow him for days before the fatal confrontation. It wasn't until Miss Marple visited the tavern's back room, where the quieter, more discreet conversations took place, that the truth finally emerged. It was Mr. Gower, the quiet, unassuming man who ran the stables on the edge of the village, who had been the watcher. For weeks he had been keeping a secret from the village, a bitter rivalry between him and the deceased, a secret that had festered in the dark corners of the moor. The victim had been the last to threaten Gower's livelihood, and in a moment of rage, Gower had confronted him. But Gower had not intended for the murder. It had been an accident, a fatal struggle in the fog, where the mist and shadows had obscured everything. Miss Marple, in her quiet way, had pieced it all together. The watcher on the moor was not a figure of the supernatural, but a man consumed by his own bitterness, his anger at the wrongs done to him. And in the fog, it had been all too easy for him to hide. Chapter 11. A handprint on the parlor wall. No one can explain how it got there, or why it won't fade. It had been a peculiar evening in St. Mary Mead, the kind that seemed to hold its breath before something would happen. The late afternoon mist had clung to the village like a veil, and the scent of wood smoke filled the air as villagers gathered in their homes, snug behind ivy-clad walls, wrapped in the comfort of their daily routines. The tea shop, as always, hummed with the low murmur of conversation, and Mrs. Lancaster's scones were in high demand, the golden crusts a small comfort against the chill. It was Mrs. Pemberton, of the grand but increasingly dilapidated manor house, at the edge of the village, who first brought the strange occurrence to Miss Marple's attention. The older woman had come into the tea shop, her usual composure shaken, a pale handkerchief clasped tightly in her hands. "Miss Marple, I do beg your pardon for disturbing you," she had said in her breathless way, "but something quite extraordinary has happened. You must come at once." Miss Marple, never one to rush, had merely nodded and followed the older woman out into the misty streets. The drive to Pemberton Manor, though only a few minutes' walk, felt long as they passed the overgrown hedgerows and the dark, looming trees. The house itself, though once grand and stately, now stood like an aging monument, its once shiny windows dull with dust, its walls half hidden by creeping ivy. Inside, the manor was as cold and quiet as the fog outside. Mrs. Pemberton, still clutching her handkerchief, led Miss Marple into the parlour. The room, furnished in a manner that spoke of better days, had an air of stillness, as though nothing had moved in it for years. But it was the wall that immediately drew Miss Marple's attention. On the pristine white wall, in the centre of the room, was a handprint, a large, smudged impression, as if someone had placed their hand on the wall, except there was no one in the house who could explain how it got there. The handprint itself was smeared, its edges blurring into the paint. But what was most curious was that the mark didn't fade, no matter how many times the wall was cleaned. It lingered stubbornly, as if it had been burned into the plaster itself. "It wasn't there last night," Mrs. Pemberton whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know how it came to be. I've scrubbed it. I've tried everything, but it won't go away." Miss Marple studied the handprint carefully, her sharp eyes catching every detail, her mind already sifting through the possibilities. There was something about it that felt deliberate, but it was hard to explain. The mark seemed to have been made with considerable force, and yet it was oddly smudged, as if the person had been in a hurry, or perhaps had been trying to leave a message of some kind. "Tell me, Mrs. Pemberton," Miss Marple began, her voice calm but insistent, "who else is in the house with you?" The older woman hesitated, wringing her handkerchief between her fingers. "Only my nephew, Gerald. He's not in the best of health, you see. He's confined to his room upstairs, but I'm sure he didn't do it. He's barely able to leave his bed." Miss Marple nodded slowly, absorbing the information. "And anyone else? Any visitors? Any strange occurrences in the last few days?" Mrs. Pemberton's eyes flickered briefly, a momentary shadow crossing her face. "There have been some odd things, but I don't want to trouble you with them, Miss Marple. It's probably nothing, just nerves, I suppose." But Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most seemingly trivial details could be the key to unlocking a mystery. "Do tell me, Mrs. Pemberton. I am certain it is nothing, until we know otherwise." With an uneasy sigh, Mrs. Pemberton sat down in the faded armchair near the fireplace. "Very well. There's been talk of things that have happened before. You see, the manor has been in our family for generations, and there are secrets, Miss Marple, long-kept secrets. My husband, well, he was an ill-tempered man, and I suppose things were said in the past. Perhaps my nephew Gerald knows more about this than I do. But the house has never felt right to me since he came back." "Your nephew, you say?" Miss Marple asked, her gaze narrowing slightly. "Has he been here long?" "Only recently," Mrs. Pemberton replied. "He had been living in London for some years, but when his health deteriorated, he came back here to live. I don't know what he's been up to exactly. There are rumors, and I've heard him arguing with someone recently, but I don't know who." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The presence of Gerald, combined with the strange handprint, seemed to be more than just coincidence. "And when did you first notice the handprint?" she asked. "It was this morning," Mrs. Pemberton said. "I woke up early and came down to make tea. When I entered the parlor, there it was, as though it had been there for hours." The room grew quiet, save for the crackling of the fire. Miss Marple stood, taking in the details of the parlor, the faded furniture, the old portraits on the walls. All of it seemed perfectly ordinary. But the handprint, with its stubborn refusal to fade, was anything but ordinary. "Mrs. Pemberton, I would like to speak to your nephew," Miss Marple said at last. "If you would be so kind as to arrange it." The younger man, Gerald, was not difficult to find. He was indeed in poor health, lying in a bed in a small room at the top of the stairs. He was pale, his face gaunt, and he seemed little more than a shadow of the man he might have once been. But his eyes were sharp, and Miss Marple could see that his mind was still very much intact. "I'm afraid I've been a burden to my aunt," Gerald said, his voice weak but clear. "She's been very kind to take me in." Miss Marple sat beside him, her gentle gaze never leaving his face. "Your aunt tells me you've had some visitors recently. Do you know anything about the handprint on the parlor wall?" Gerald's eyes flickered, and for a moment Miss Marple saw a fleeting look of guilt. But it was gone as quickly as it had come. I don't know anything about it, Miss Marple. I've been in here all day, unable to leave my bed. I'm sure my aunt must be imagining things." Miss Marple studied him for a long moment, her eyes sharp and calculating. The story was beginning to come together, but there was one final piece of the puzzle she needed. After a few more minutes of conversation, Miss Marple stood up, her conclusion becoming clearer. She had no doubt about the handprint now, or its meaning. It had been left intentionally, a deliberate act meant to unsettle, to give a message to the one who would notice. The handprint was not a sign of madness, nor was it the result of a supernatural force, as Mrs. Pemberton had feared. It was a symbol, one Gerald had left for his aunt, a reminder of the things that had been buried beneath the manor's roof, of secrets that had been hidden for years. And as Miss Marple had suspected, it had been Gerald, in a fit of desperation and rage, who had left it there. His actions, driven by his own guilt and the family's long-held grudges, had come to the surface in a way that no one could ignore. "The handprint will fade, Mrs. Pemberton," Miss Marple said, quietly, as they returned to the parlor. "But the truths it marks will not." Chapter 12. A Shadow in the Candlelight. The murderer is closer than anyone dares to believe. The evening in St. Mary Mead had descended quietly, as it always did, with the first stars beginning to blink lazily into the darkening sky. The village, nestled in the soft embrace of the countryside, was cloaked in the kind of calm that only a rural English village could offer. The ivy-clad cottages seemed to settle into the evening as if they too were ready for rest. A faint mist began to curl at the edges of the cobblestone streets, creeping into the hedgerows and over the garden walls. Inside the village tea shop, the last of the afternoon visitors were finishing their tea, contentedly chatting about the day's events. The warmth of the fire crackled softly in the hearth, and Mrs. Lancaster bustled about, serving the final scones of the day to a group of village regulars, their laughter light, though their conversation remained guarded, as it often did in such a close-knit community. Yet just outside the warmth of the tea shop's walls, the village had begun to feel the chill of a darker mystery. The murder of young Edward Pembroke, heir to the Pemberton estate, had sent ripples through St. Mary Mead, though few dared to speak of it openly. Edward, a mild-mannered young man who had recently returned from London, had been found in the study of Pemberton Manor late one foggy evening. His death appeared to be the result of a fatal blow to the head, though the circumstances surrounding his demise were anything but straightforward. Miss Marple, always one to observe rather than speak, had been following the events closely. The Pemberton family, well respected in the village, had not long ago been in the midst of a quiet social upheaval, following the strange circumstances surrounding Mrs. Pemberton's nephew Gerald and the unsettling occurrences within the manor itself. Yet, despite the apparent calm that had returned to the village after the resolution of those matters, there was now a new tension, a fear that gripped the very air. The murder had, of course, thrown the village into turmoil. A local constable, a steady but unimaginative man named Sergeant Hodges, had conducted his investigation in a careful, methodical manner, though Miss Marple had her doubts. He had already interviewed several villagers, and though there were a few leads, nothing substantial had yet emerged. Edward had been known for being amiable and generally well-liked. His young widow, Claire, was distraught, but seemed to have no obvious motive for such a brutal crime. The household servants, too, appeared to have been more or less accounted for. Still, there was an undercurrent of suspicion that something deeper was at play. It was in the dim candlelight of Pemberton Manor, where Miss Marple found herself one evening, that the threads of the mystery began to weave themselves together. She had been invited by Mrs. Pemberton, who had insisted on Miss Marple's quiet counsel in these uncertain times. The house was as somber as ever, its once grand halls now heavy with the weight of grief. Even the shadows seemed to gather in the corners of the room, eager to hide any secrets that might be lurking. Mrs. Pemberton, seated in a plush armchair by the fire, looked every bit the mourning widow, though her eyes, hidden behind the layers of lace and veil, told a different story. She had been unusually quiet since Miss Marple arrived, her fingers twisting nervously in the folds of her gown. "I must ask you, Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "to solve this for us. Edward, my poor, poor Edward. It seems impossible that such a tragedy could occur in our family." Miss Marple gave her a reassuring look, though her mind was already elsewhere, processing the details of the house and its inhabitants. It was, after all, often the most familiar of places that hid the darkest of secrets. "I will do my best, Mrs. Pemberton," Miss Marple said gently, her eyes scanning the room. "But I fear the answers are not always where we would like them to be." The room, with its rich, dark wood paneling and heavy curtains, seemed oddly still, as though the very house itself was holding its breath. The faint glow from the fire did little to warm the space, and the shadows in the corners only seemed to deepen. A sudden noise broke the silence, an unexpected knock on the door, followed by the appearance of Sergeant Hodges, his face as stern as usual, but his eyes carrying an expression of frustration. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with a nod, his gaze moving quickly between her and Mrs. Pemberton. "We've made no headway. I can't explain it. There doesn't seem to be any sign of forced entry, and yet Edward was clearly not alone in that study." Miss Marple's eyes flickered briefly over to the large fireplace, where the shadows were particularly deep. "Tell me, Sergeant, how was it that you determined he wasn't alone?" Hodges shifted uncomfortably. The initial investigation suggested it. Edward's desk had been disturbed, papers scattered about. But the most curious thing, there was a shadow, faint but definite, on the wall opposite the desk. It's as if someone had been standing just out of view. There's no other explanation. Miss Marple sat back, considering this new information. A shadow? In the candlelight? It was an odd thing indeed, something out of place in such a carefully arranged setting. But it was also a detail that told Miss Marple more than it might have told someone else. The shadow was not just a product of the light, it was a clue. "I see," Miss Marple murmured, her mind beginning to unravel the meaning behind the oddities. "And yet you say there were no signs of forced entry?" Sergeant Hodges nodded, his brow furrowing. "Yes, everything was in its place, or so it seemed. No valuables were taken. It's as if the murder occurred without any real purpose. Except, of course, for the victim's life," Miss Marple added softly, her tone almost absent as she turned to Mrs. Pemberton. "Was anyone in the house, especially close to Edward, someone who might have had a reason to be in the study without being noticed?" Mrs. Pemberton's hand trembled, and her gaze dropped to her lap. There was a pause, a long one, before she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "My nephew, Gerald." Miss Marple's sharp eyes turned to Mrs. Pemberton. "Gerald? But I understood him to be quite ill." Mrs. Pemberton nodded, but there was something guarded in her demeanor now. "He was, Miss Marple. But Gerald was ambitious, and in his condition, he knew that his future would always be tied to the family's fortune. I feared he might have become desperate, and I've caught him sneaking around the manor late at night. I didn't think much of it at first, but after Edward's death, Miss Marple rose, her mind already working. "Then it seems the shadow was not a trick of the light after all. It was Gerald, closer than anyone dared to believe." She turned to Sergeant Hodges, her eyes glinting with quiet certainty. "The shadow on the wall wasn't cast by a stranger. It was cast by someone who knew exactly how to move undetected, someone who was desperate enough to act, and yet too fearful to be seen. It was Gerald, of course, who had been hiding in the darkness, lurking just out of view, in the very room where his uncle had met his end. His motive was clear: desperation. And, as Miss Marple had suspected, his illness had given him the perfect cover for his actions. A shadow in the candlelight, indeed, but one that was finally brought to light." Chapter 13. The Curse of Greystone Manor. Is the house itself to blame for the horrors within? Greystone Manor, with its ivy-clad stone walls and towering spires, stood at the very edge of St. Mary Mead, its silhouette dark against the early evening sky. For as long as anyone in the village could remember, the manor had been a place of quiet mystery and whispered gossip. The grand house, built generations ago, had become a symbol of old wealth and forgotten secrets, its rooms heavy with the weight of history, and its halls echoing with long-buried grudges. No one could truly say why it had fallen into disrepair over the years. Some said it was the curse of its past, others that the house itself had a dark influence on its inhabitants. The latest tragedy at Greystone had set the village abuzz with talk of fate and superstition. The body of Eleanor Hastings, the young widow who had come to live at Greystone just a few months earlier, had been discovered in the study, her life snuffed out as though by an unseen hand. The cause of death was unclear, though the position of the body, slumped across the desk as though in the midst of a moment of contemplation, was eerie enough to send a chill down the spine of anyone who had the misfortune of walking into that room. There were no signs of a struggle, no obvious wounds, but the heavy air of death seemed to cling to the room like a tangible presence. The villagers were quick to speak of a curse. It was whispered that every occupant of Greystone Manor had met an untimely end, that the house itself had been built atop a forgotten graveyard, or that some ancient wrong had been done by the Hastings family long ago. Yet despite the ominous rumors, Miss Marple felt that there was something more to the death than the mere legends that had grown around the manor. She had lived in St. Mary Mead long enough to know that while the villagers' imaginations were often fueled by fear, the truth was nearly always more subtle and complex. As she made her way toward Greystone that evening, the fog swirling around her feet and the moon barely visible behind a shroud of cloud, Miss Marple's mind was already working through the possibilities. The manor's current occupants were few. Eleanor Hastings, of course, but also her cousin, the reclusive and rather peculiar Mr. Oliver Hastings, who had returned to the house after a long absence, and the staff, most notably the housekeeper, Mrs. Blanchard, who had served the family for decades. It was a small household, but one full of intriguing personalities and long-hidden secrets. Inside the manor, the cold, dark wood paneling of the entry hall loomed as though the house were watching her. Mrs. Blanchard, an elderly woman with a stern face that had been weathered by years of service, led Miss Marple into the drawing room. She, like the rest of the staff, had been visibly shaken by Eleanor's sudden death. Miss Marple observed the housekeeper carefully, noting the tightness in her movements and the way she seemed to avoid looking at the stairway that led to the second floor. "I know you must have many questions, Miss Marple," Mrs. Blanchard said, her voice quavering slightly as she poured a cup of tea for the detective. "But I assure you, it's the house itself, that cursed place. My family has served the Hastings for generations, and I can tell you, there's something wrong here. Something that never feels right." Miss Marple nodded, taking a sip of tea, her thoughts already processing the housekeeper's words. It wasn't uncommon for those who lived in grand, isolated homes to develop such feelings of foreboding. And yet Miss Marple could sense there was more to the story than just superstition. "Tell me about Eleanor," she asked, gently, her gaze sharp as it rested on Mrs. Blanchard's face. The housekeeper hesitated before answering. She was a sweet woman, Miss Marple, but her presence here seemed to disturb the balance of the house. She was always wondering, asking questions about the past, about the Hastings family. She would often stay up late in the study, reading through old family records and letters. And then, well, after she'd been here for a few weeks, strange things started happening. Lights flickered in the halls. Objects moved on their own. At night, I heard voices, but when I went to check, nothing. Miss Marple listened quietly, her mind piecing together the fragments of Mrs. Blanchard's story. "And Mr. Oliver Hastings?" she asked, her voice measured. "What do you know of him?" Mrs. Blanchard's face darkened. "Mr. Oliver is a peculiar man. He's not like his cousin Eleanor. He keeps to himself, rarely leaves the house, and when he does speak, it's often about things best left forgotten. I don't trust him, Miss Marple. He seems to be hiding something." Miss Marple noted the tone of suspicion in Mrs. Blanchard's voice. It was telling, though it revealed little more than the housekeeper's growing unease. "And the night Eleanor died, was anyone with her?" "No, Miss Marple," Mrs. Blanchard replied quickly. "She was alone in the study. I checked the room myself this morning. There was no sign of anyone else having been there." Miss Marple finished her tea and stood, her gaze sweeping over the darkened hallway. She had seen enough. "I think it is time I have a look at the study myself." Mrs. Blanchard's face stiffened. "You may, of course, Miss Marple, but I warn you, it's not a room I'd want to linger in." The study was as imposing as the rest of the manor, its high, arched windows casting long shadows on the walls. The room was neat, almost too neat, with the faint scent of ink and paper lingering in the air. A large mahogany desk sat in the center of the room. Papers neatly stacked but clearly disturbed. Miss Marple's eyes fell on the chair behind the desk, where Eleanor had been found. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication that Eleanor had been attacked, but there was something about the arrangement of the room that bothered Miss Marple. The flickering candle on the desk caught her attention, its flame wavering as if disturbed by an unseen draught, though the room was still. Miss Marple leaned closer, her eyes narrowing as they fell upon a faint, smudged mark on the wall behind the desk, a handprint, barely visible but unmistakable, as if someone had placed a hand there in haste. "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured. The handprint was not the kind one would expect from a casual touch. It was too deliberate, too forceful, as though someone had been desperate to leave their mark. But why? As she continued her examination of the room, she came upon a series of letters scattered on the desk. They were old, yellowed with age, and they appeared to be correspondence between Eleanor and a mysterious person from her past. There were references to debts and promises made, but one letter stood out to Miss Marple, a note from a solicitor, written just days before Eleanor's death. The words were simple, but damning. "The family estate is under threat. You must make your decision soon." It was the final piece of the puzzle. Eleanor had been on the verge of uncovering something about the Hastings family's past, something that threatened their very future. But who would have wanted to stop her from finding the truth? Miss Marple's mind turned quickly, and as she walked back into the hall, she knew exactly who the killer was. It was not the house that had cursed its inhabitants. It was the secrets buried deep within its walls that had driven the Hastings family to their tragic end. And now, one final secret had claimed Eleanor's life. She turned to Mrs. Blanchard, her eyes steely with certainty. "I believe I have the answer to your mystery, Mrs. Blanchard," Miss Marple said softly. "The murderer, as it happens, is much closer than anyone could have imagined. It was Oliver Hastings, of course. He had been the one to push Eleanor too far, desperate to protect the family's legacy and the secrets he had long guarded. The handprint, the strange atmosphere in the room, and the hidden letters, these were all clues pointing directly to him. The house, with its towering presence and brooding shadows, had not been the curse. It had merely been a silent witness to the horrors within. Chapter 14. The Bone China Doll's Smile. A forgotten relic holds the answer to everything. St. Mary Mead was draped in the quiet hush of early morning, the sun barely breaking through a thin veil of mist that hung like a memory over the village. The ivy-clad cottages, with their thatched roofs and neatly tended gardens, stood like sentinels against the encroaching fog. A few villagers, wrapped in their woolen coats and scarves, went about their morning chores, though the air was thick with something heavier than the mist, a tension that had not been present in the usually placid village. It was the kind of quiet that heralded the calm before a storm. The murder of Mrs. Louisa Ashcombe, a woman of some wealth and considerable age, had shattered the village's usual peace. Mrs. Ashcombe had been found late one evening, sprawled on the floor of her sitting room, a heavy weight having fallen on her from the top shelf of a cabinet. The circumstances of her death seemed more tragic than sinister. An unfortunate accident, many had believed, but Miss Marple had her doubts. The evidence, or rather the lack of it, bothered her. No signs of forced entry, no obvious struggle. Yet the woman had been alone, and the cabinet had not been disturbed in the way one might expect from an accidental fall. As always, Miss Marple had been observing the details that others might miss, her sharp mind piecing together the fragments of a larger puzzle. She had known Mrs. Ashcombe for many years, though their relationship had been nothing more than the occasional chat over tea in the village's cosy tea room. It was then, in that same tea room, that Miss Marple had overheard something rather unsettling from Mrs. Lancaster, the owner of the shop. "You know," Mrs. Lancaster had said, in a low, conspiratorial tone, "there's something quite curious about Mrs. Ashcombe's things. I was in her house just the other day, helping her tidy up, and I came across the most unusual thing." She paused, her face half hidden behind the lace curtains as she wiped down a table. $1. Not one of those modern ones, but an old bone china one. Its smile was almost too perfect. It looked like it belonged in a museum, not a sitting room. Miss Marple's interest had been piqued immediately. $1, bone china no less. It was an odd thing for a woman like Mrs. Ashcombe to keep, especially given the way she had always kept to herself. A doll, it seemed, had been part of something much more significant than a mere collector's trinket. The next day, Miss Marple had made her way to Mrs. Ashcombe's house, a fine Georgian structure that stood somewhat apart from the rest of the village, with its wide front garden and imposing stone steps. The house had been silent and still, its windows dark behind the drawn curtains. Miss Marple entered without ceremony, for Mrs. Ashcombe's housekeeper had been more than willing to let her in. The woman had gone on a walk in the village, leaving the house empty and open to the detective's inquiries. It didn't take long for Miss Marple to find the cabinet. It stood against the wall in the sitting room, its heavy wooden doors slightly ajar. The shelves inside were filled with a hodgepodge of knickknacks, framed photographs, glass vases, old books. But it was the bone china doll, perched on the top shelf, that immediately drew Miss Marple's attention. It was a doll of remarkable craftsmanship, its porcelain face serene, yet somehow unsettling, with a painted smile that seemed frozen in time. The delicate hands, poised in a stiff gesture, appeared as though they were about to move, though no such thing occurred. The doll's eyes, cold and lifeless, seemed to watch Miss Marple with an eerie awareness. After a careful examination of the room, Miss Marple turned her attention back to the doll. Something about it felt wrong, though she couldn't quite place her finger on it. It was not simply the doll itself, but the fact that it had been left untouched for years, no family members to care for it, no grandchildren running about to show interest in such a relic. Mrs. Ashcombe had always been a solitary woman, but the doll was so perfectly placed, so carefully displayed, that it seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. The housekeeper had returned, her face drawn and tired. "I do apologize, Miss Marple," the woman said, wringing her hands. "I didn't expect anyone to be here. I should have locked the door behind me." Miss Marple gave her a kind smile. "There's no harm done. I simply came to look around, you see. There's something I've been wondering about." She gestured toward the cabinet. "Could you tell me more about the doll?" The housekeeper's face tightened, her gaze flicking to the bone china doll. "That doll," she murmured, "was given to Mrs. Ashcombe years ago, when she was just a girl. I believe it was from a distant relative, someone from the family's past. But no one ever spoke much of it. It's always been there." Miss Marple noted the housekeeper's unease and gently probed further. "And where was it kept before?" The housekeeper hesitated, her voice lowering. "In a box, I think. For years it had been stored away, until Mrs. Ashcombe decided it needed to be displayed. She seemed so pleased with it then, but I don't know, Miss Marple. Something about that doll. It gives me the chills. It doesn't belong in this house." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The housekeeper's discomfort was palpable, but it was not enough to make her dismiss the doll just yet. As she examined the room again, she noted something curious. The chair in front of the cabinet was slightly out of place, its legs marking faint impressions in the dust. It was as though someone had recently moved it, perhaps to get a closer look at the doll. Turning back to the housekeeper, Miss Marple asked, "Did Mrs. Ashcombe ever speak of this doll to you, or mention anything unusual about it?" The housekeeper's face paled. "No, Miss Marple. She never said much. But sometimes, just sometimes, I'd hear her talking to it. Late at night, in the sitting room." Miss Marple's thoughts began to crystallize. Mrs. Ashcombe had been a woman who was clearly haunted by her past, and it seemed that the doll, this forgotten relic, was more than just an innocent object. It had been a symbol, perhaps, of something darker, something hidden, away for years. But what had driven Mrs. Ashcombe to speak to it in the dead of night? As Miss Marple walked back toward the front door, her mind raced. She now had the full picture. The doll's smile, so fixed and unchanging, had been the key all along. It had been part of a tragic family secret, one that Mrs. Ashcombe had never fully understood, but one that had led to her untimely end. The smile, frozen in bone china, was not simply the product of craftsmanship. It was the final clue to the mystery of Mrs. Ashcombe's death. Returning to the village, Miss Marple met with Sergeant Hodges and recounted everything she had discovered. She had pieced together the truth. The doll had belonged to a long-lost relative of Mrs. Ashcombe, a woman who had been involved in a family tragedy many years ago. It was this woman, now long dead, whose spirit had haunted the Ashcombe family, and it was her influence, the unresolved guilt, the unfinished business, that had driven Mrs. Ashcombe to her death. In the end, it was not the house that had cursed the family, but the weight of their own history. The doll, with its bone china smile, had held the answers all along, answers that had been buried and forgotten, until Miss Marple had come to uncover them. "A forgotten relic," Miss Marple said, with a soft smile of her own, "holds the answer to everything, if only we have the patience to look." Chapter 15. The Murderer's Final Cup of Tea. Miss Marple gathers them all, but only one will taste the truth. The morning mist hung thick over St. Mary Mead. The quiet village bathed in a soft grey light, as though the earth itself were holding its breath. The ivy-clad cottages, nestled against the cobblestone streets, their chimneys billowing faint wisps of smoke into the still air. A few villagers shuffled quietly about their early routines, but there was a sense of unease that lingered, as though even the flowers in the garden knew something had shifted. Miss Marple, however, had never been one to be swayed by the superficial calm that enveloped the village. Her sharp eyes saw beneath the layers of propriety and civility that the residents wore like a second skin. It had been a long time since anything had ruffled the peace of St. Mary Mead, but the recent murder of Colonel Archibald Lambert had done just that. The colonel, a man of solid reputation and no known enemies, had been found in his study 2 days ago, a single fatal wound to his chest. The room had been locked from the inside, and yet no clear explanation had emerged for his untimely demise. The villagers, as was typical, had whispered their theories. Some had suggested an affair gone wrong. Others had hinted at a long-buried grudge from his time in the army. But Miss Marple had not been fooled. She knew the truth was far simpler and far darker than the stories circulating through the village. Now, sitting in the small, cozy drawing room of the Lambert family home, Miss Marple surveyed the small gathering she had summoned. She had called together the people who had known Colonel Lambert best, certain that one of them held the key to the mystery. As always, her instincts had not led her astray. The scene before her was as perfect a cross-section of village life as she could have hoped for. A mix of old friends, family, and acquaintances, all gathered under the guise of politeness, but each of them hiding something. Seated beside the fire was Mrs. Lambert, the Colonel's wife, a woman whose composure seemed unshaken, but whose eyes flickered nervously when Miss Marple met her gaze. She was the picture of upper-class elegance, dressed in mourning black. At her tense shoulders and the way she kept her hands folded tightly in her lap told another story. Next to her sat her niece, Miss Clarissa Dalrymple, a young woman of striking beauty, but with an air of fragility about her. She seemed utterly composed on the surface, but there was a nervousness in the way her fingers played with the lace of her handkerchief. Standing near the window was Major Geoffrey Hallam, an old army friend of the Colonel, tall and dignified, yet there was something in his stance, a subtle rigidity, that suggested he was not entirely at ease. To his side was his wife Margaret, who held her own stiff composure. Her sharp eyes darted about the room as though trying to read everyone else's thoughts. And then there was the butler, Thomas, a man who had served the Lambert family for many years, his face impassive, though Miss Marple noted the faintest tension around his jaw. Miss Marple took a moment, her eyes resting on each of them, before she spoke, her voice soft but commanding. "You are all here, of course, because Colonel Lambert's death has left us with more questions than answers," she began, her gaze sweeping over the group. "But I have come to the conclusion that it is not simply the Colonel's death that requires resolution. It is the secrets that each of you carries with you that must be brought into the light." The room fell silent, save for the crackling of the fire. Miss Marple allowed the silence to linger, letting it settle in the corners of the room until she spoke again. "I believe the answer to the Colonel's death lies in a most unexpected place, in the ritual that you all share, in the very act of sitting down for tea. A cup of tea, you see, has always been a symbol of trust and civility. But sometimes it is the last thing one ever tastes before they meet their end." Mrs. Lambert's hand tightened in her lap, her lips pressed together in a thin line. Clarissa Dalrymple's eyes flickered toward the door, as if considering an escape, while Major Hallam's jaw clenched. Margaret Hallam looked directly at Miss Marple, her gaze unflinching. "You have no idea what you're suggesting, Miss Marple," Mrs. Lambert said, her voice tight with a mixture of disbelief and disdain. "Ah, but I do," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm and unwavering. "And I believe that, in this very room, there are those who know exactly what I mean." She rose slowly from her chair, her movements deliberate. She crossed the room and approached the table, where the remains of a half-drunk pot of tea sat, steam still rising from the surface of the liquid. Miss Marple took a seat again, her eyes glinting, as she gestured for them all to look at the teapot. "I find it most curious," she said, her tone thoughtful, "that this teapot has not been touched since Colonel Lambert's death. You see, there is something in the way the tea is poured that tells me much more than you might expect." She turned to Mrs. Lambert, her gaze steady. "When Colonel Lambert was found, there was no sign of a struggle, no forced entry. In fact, the only thing out of place was the way his cup had been left on the table. The tea had been poured, but it was never drunk. Why, I wondered, would a man go through the motion of preparing his tea, but not drink it?" Mrs. Lambert shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but said nothing. Miss Marple turned to Major Hallam next. "It was you, Major, wasn't it? You were the one who offered the Colonel the last cup of tea. You were there just before he passed, weren't you? You had been with him earlier that day, discussing matters of business and family. But you made one mistake, Major. You misjudged the strength of the poison." The color drained from Major Hallam's face as his eyes widened. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Margaret Hallam, however, rose to her feet in a flash, her composure shattered. "It was not Geoffrey," she cried, her voice quivering. "It was me. I couldn't stand it any longer. He was going to ruin us all. He was threatening to tell everyone about the money we'd borrowed from him, the investments that had failed. I was desperate." Her confession fell heavy in the air, like a stone. Everyone in the room stood frozen, the weight of the truth finally settling upon them. Miss Marple looked at Margaret Hallam, her eyes kind but firm. "You see," Miss Marple said, "it was the final cup of tea that revealed the truth. The one that wasn't drunk, the one that carried the poison intended for the Colonel, but when it was poured, the dose was too strong. Colonel Lambert, perhaps suspicious or unwilling to trust, never took that last sip." Miss Marple turned back to the teapot, as if the answer had been staring her in the face all along. The truth always comes to light, no matter how carefully it is hidden, Miss Marple said, with a quiet finality that left no room for doubt. And sometimes, the smallest of details, the act of offering a simple cup of tea, can reveal the deepest secrets. As Sergeant Hodges led Margaret Hallam away, Miss Marple remained seated, her sharp eyes taking in the reactions of the others. The village, once again, would return to its quiet routine, but it would never be quite the same. And as the teapot cooled, its steam, a reminder of what had just passed, Miss Marple couldn't help but smile to herself. She had once again uncovered the truth, one cup at a time.